Hello, my name is Mollie Ziegler Hemingway. I'm a writer for, I write about religion and other topics for getreligion.org and a variety of other outlets. And I'm here with the man, the myth, the legend.
Wajahat Ali.
And where do you write?
I am a commentator, a playwright, and right now I'm a researcher and writer for the Center for American Progress. Usually you can find my articles, opinion articles on The Guardian, Huffington Post, Salon, and Washington Post.
Great. And Wajahat and I are here to discuss a not fun topic, but last week we saw the horrible terror attack and shooting spree in Norway. And we're looking at some of the fallout from that terror attack and what influences might have been in play for the terrorists. So why are we talking about this? Why, what do we know about the terrorists thus far, Wajahat?
So what we know so far is that a 32-year-old white Norwegian man decided to carry out, it seemed he has claimed responsibility for carrying out two deadly attacks in Oslo, which have left 76 people dead, including mostly youth. There was a bomb blast that killed 8 individuals. It was a bomb blast of a government building. A few hours later, the same individual opened fire on an island where it was a youth camp and killed 68 youth. It's probably one of the most devastating tragedies that has hit Norway in decades, and it is absolutely just devastating what's happened. It's heartbreaking. What's also a little bit more disconcerting, and just as disconcerting, is that it seemed to be, I would say, ideologically inspired, in the sense that he left behind a 1,500-page manifesto/memo where in breathtaking detail he pretty much described what he was about to do and what he did, how he did it, and it seems to be not only an explanation but also sort of a kind of to inspire, if you will, like-minded individuals to find common cause with him. He wanted to give them a how-to guide if they wanted to do this as well. And he seems, in my opinion, he seems at least not a crazy person, because he seems to have at least outlined or articulated why he did what he did. So there seems to be not just a crazy action.
I think that's an important point. Many times when there are horrific acts of terror, the Jared Loughner case in Tucson, it was almost immediately apparent that the man was paranoid schizophrenic. This man. I never watch TV, so I'm not sure if I'm butchering how to pronounce his name, but is it Anders Breivik or Breivik?
I'm going to go with Breivik.
Okay, so Breivik is, certainly narcissistic, and I'm sure he has a full run of personality disorders, but he is not insane. I mean, the Manifesto, which I read over the course of much of the last week, is cogent, it's coherent, it relies on a great body of work from other people. It's batshit insane too, but it's not. He's thought it out, and it's internally consistent. And to that extent, it kind of reminds me a great deal of Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber Manifesto, which was also very internally consistent. Mad as it may have been. But what was really interesting going through this is that much of the manifesto is just lifting of essays, blog posts, writings from people who write about the threat of Islamic terrorism. And some of those people are, completely sober-minded types, and some of them are of the more extreme type. And so, so what do you think that means? Like, what are you saying we should think about the fact that he cited so many of these people?
Yeah, so I think, based on the evidence that you've mentioned, based on the evidence at hand, what we've seen, specifically that 1,500-page manifesto, I am safe to make the following. It is safe for me to make the following statement that Breivik was, at the very least, ideologically inspired by the anti-Muslim bigoted writings of certain American Islamophobes, whom he cites numerous times in his manifesto. I mean, just to give you some numbers, he cites Robert Spencer and Robert Spencer's blog Jihad Watch 162 times in the document. He cites Robert Spencer's frequent collaborator Pamela Geller of the Atlas Shrugged blogs 12 times. He cites Daniel Pipes and his, quote-unquote think tank Middle East Forum around 15 times. He cites Frank Gaffney and Center for Security Policy 7 times, David Horowitz, Steve Emerson. He posted a video of Bridget Gabriel and her anti-Muslim group, grassroots organization Act for America. Now, I think the question then is, for me, it's no doubt that he was at least ideologically inspired based on his own writings, Mollie, in the manifesto, where he pretty much openly says, this is my problem. My beef is with multiculturalism in Europe, the threat of, quote unquote, of Muslim immigration, and what he calls the, quote, Islamic colonization of Europe. And he cites the writings of individuals and organizations who I believe have profited over the past few years by exploiting the, if you will, the existing fears and hysteria against Muslims. And so I'm not saying that these individuals that we've mentioned are directly responsible for Breivik and his actions, not at all, nor that they necessarily catapulted him directly, but definitely their writings and their ideology seems to have inspired his ideology.
I think it's important to note a few things first. One would be that in a 1,500-page document, a lot of people are cited. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is cited, Mahatma Gandhi is cited, the Declaration of Independence is cited. His this Breivik guy tweeted that John Stuart Mill's quote before the attack. There are a lot of people that he used. I mean, there's scripture citations. There are also Quranic citations. I mean, it's a prolific piece of work, and there are a lot of people cited. It's also true that, he obviously is a huge anti-multiculturalist, and his whole point is that all of these groups that were out there and all of these people he's citing, he actually opposes them because they don't call for violence as a means to an end. So I don't know how fruitful it is to lay blame at their feet when he's, certainly he's quoting from them to build up his case that there's threat of either Islamic terrorism or just Muslims in general, as some of these anti-Muslim bigots write. But it's also true that he couldn't go to them for justification of his violence. He's the one that took, either mainstream concern over multiculturalism or extreme rhetoric against multiculturalism. And he's the guy who added the violence to it. I mean, I'd be much more concerned if he was using these people and saying, like, this is why we, using their actual words to justify the violence that he was engaged in, rather than the concern he had about multiculturalism. So I'm not sure how helpful it is to lay blame with these people when, every single one of them has renounced the violence, even if they share the concern that he had over these topics. So it just seems like kind of, I guess what concerns me is that it's really a fine line between having legitimate concern about the rhetoric and exploiting the deaths of these people for political gain. And I think that the rhetoric of some of these anti-Muslim bigots was just as much of a problem before this attack happened as it is now. And it's a problem because of the inherent problem of what they're saying. It's a problem because, some of these people are unable to distinguish between violent jihad and every Muslim on earth. And that's the problem. It'd be a problem whether or not someone, in Norway who's like a pretty extreme individual uses that writing to for his document that he's putting out there. I think that we should be just as concerned about the rhetoric, whether or not someone, kind of goes off on his own. And it's important to remember that, even when he's citing these people, he couldn't cite them as justification for what he was about to do.
I think we can both, based on what you said, we can both agree that, he is directly responsible for committing these violent actions, and I'm not comfortable going to that extreme length and saying, the writings of these individuals, or necessarily even these individuals themselves, told Breivik to go forth and commit these heinous acts. What I'm talking about, and you kind of touched upon this, is exposing the rhetoric and hateful ideology of these individuals who are far more influential than we give them credit for, but are not necessarily as known to the American public, who create, and I do in a sense agree here with Mark Sageman, who was quoted in the New York Times, the former CIA analyst and current counterterrorism specialist, that their rhetoric. I know you quoted in your article. The rhetoric of these individuals is not cost-free, in the sense that I think Breivik emerged from the same ideological infrastructure as these individuals, and specifically, you're right. There is a distinction between those who have what we might say is perhaps politically incorrect discourse about multiculturalism. Some people don't like that, and then there is a fine line between those who cross it. So, for example, when it comes to Robert Spencer and it comes to Pamela Geller, these people are not only just bloggers, but they co-created an organization called Stop Islamization of America, which the Anti-Defamation League has reviewed all the rhetoric and actions and concluded that this group promotes a conspiratorial fear-mongering against Muslims and vilifies the Islamic faith, under the guise, of course, of allegedly fighting radical Islam. Same thing that happened with Bridget Gabriel's group, Act for America. And I think what's fascinating here is kind of the ideological inspiration that these groups have from what we can openly say is fascist, far-right, racist, right-wing groups in Europe. So, for example, Stop Islamization of America was inspired directly by, I think it was Anders Graver's Stop Islamization of Europe group, which has been cited by pretty much majority of the individuals being this, again, far-right, racist, anti-Muslim, fascist organization. And, the thing is, Mollie, is that I think their words, again, create this hostile environment where the current fears that exist can be exploited. I mean, look, what we saw with these individuals, they're not just spouting rhetoric, which is, okay, yeah, it's anti-Muslim, but I mean, it seems to be so bigoted and so deep-seated in their hatred of Muslims that it plays on, again, these same ideological fears that Breivik seems to have also. The Muslim takeover, Islamic colonization, the fact that there's no such thing, as you mentioned, there's no distinction between moderate Islam and radical Islam, and the fact, I think, the environment that we're living in is that these individuals get mainstream play. So I think I agree with you that this should not be exploited by anyone. But I think we should be.
That's the opposite of the truth.
We should use this to expose this rhetoric, and that it's harmful.
But see, I actually think it's the fact that the whole reason why these. Well, I can get a little hyperbolic here, but there's a market for this type of rhetoric precisely because the mainstream media and more mainstream outlets in general are not comfortable talking about, jihad in any sort of nuanced or complex way. This is something that obviously took root after September 11th, and there were so many elites from George Bush to people in the media on down who seemed to think that the most important thing to do was just to calm any fears that people had about Islam. And so instead of getting like a really interesting discussion where we talk about the causes for concern or whatnot, it's generally kind of brushed away. Where Islam is either presented as monolithically awesome, religion of peace at all times, don't worry about a thing, or you get into this kind of like fever swamp of the counter-jihadist rhetoric where it's always evil at all times and all Muslims can't be trusted. No Muslims can be trusted. And so what I'm worried about is that instead of shining a light on this rhetoric or bringing out the concerns that people have into the light of day, what we're really doing is trying to use this opportunity to further stigmatize totally legit concerns people might have about jihad or other avenues for violence within Islam. And so that to me would be a much worse way of solving the problem than just stigmatizing the speech or acting like it's beyond the pale. I think that they're actually, I personally find a lot of the rhetoric hateful, bigoted, racist, unrealistic. It's unhelpful no matter how you cut it. But I think the important thing is to actually bring these people more into the discussion rather than stigmatize them further.
See, this is where I would disagree, because I think that first of all, these people need to be exposed for their type of bigoted language. I think I'll give you a quick example. if we're having a discussion on race relations, and suppose we're on CNN, and we're going to talk about, let's just say, the race relations and race dialogue when it comes to African Americans in America. If you have David Duke on CNN, your audience is going to know about David Duke's rich history, if you will, of what most people would safely say is racist attitudes towards African Americans. Most mainstream organizations and most mainstream media outlets would probably rarely invite David Duke, and if they did, the audience would quickly know what his viewpoint is when it comes to this issue. What I have a problem with is there is a lack of distinction, I think, even in American discourse, when it comes to identifying those who you have mentioned might, bring out what is legitimate a discourse, which might be disagreeable to some, but it is done under a tone or in guise of, legal scholarship or even academic scholarship, and someone who is probably, without a very visible bias, as opposed to these individuals who have been like Pamela Geller, Robert Spencer, I would say Daniel Pipes, Steve Emerson, cited numerous times in Breivik's Manifesto, who have a deep-seated agenda that I do not think most Americans know that how deep-seated it is.
Well,
and how it's
do you
want
every time a CARE spokesman is on to have them identified as an unindicted co-conspirator in a terrorist financing trial?
I think no. Look,
I mean,
I don't
it seems
think
like
the equivalence of CARE to a fringe group like Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer. I mean, why is Pamela Geller a person who has openly said any devout Muslim should not be allowed to serve in the U.S. military? Okay, this is what she said. Why is this individual repeatedly brought on mainstream media news to be a legitimate quote-unquote conservative counterweight to your liberal?
Do you know why? I think here's the concern though. These people have beclowned themselves through their own rhetoric. They are so extreme as to be almost unable to take seriously, in my view. But that's kind of a symptom of the overall problem, which is that it's not like we can pretend that there isn't an actual problem with Muslim terrorism. It's something that happens weekly, if not more, throughout the world, and particularly in Muslim countries. And it's not something that people understand well. It's not something they discuss, and it's so often treated as something that you can easily dismiss because crazy people like Geller are talking about it. She's very easy to dismiss. She's done that to herself through her unrealistic, bigoted rhetoric. But that doesn't mean that this isn't a very serious conversation that needs talking about. And what I guess I'm concerned about is, there are leaders of European countries who have expressed concern about problems with multiculturalism, and I gather that in Europe, assimilation doesn't happen quite as easily or as well as it does here in the States, where we're very, where these things work out much better. I'm worried that rhetoric is going to be stigmatized because of people like Geller and other people like her who are so extreme when they talk about these problems. That's when that New York Times story about how this is sort of what it just seemed like. Well, this dude cited all these people, and so therefore we can dismiss all these people and their concerns. No, and I just think that's just kind of like an authoritarian, scary approach to. To me, again, I have so much confidence in the rightness of freedom and democracy to handle, some of these issues, that I have no worry about engaging these discussions in the public square. And I would much rather do that than just send them off to the fever swamps where they get more riled up and more freaked out and feel more disenfranchised and feel more like they need to resort to, horrific terror. And I think that, this is not just for right-wing terror, but also for Islamic extremism. I think that, you can vilify the hatefulness or the, murderous instincts, but it's still a good idea to engage the discussion.
I think, and this is the problem, is how do we engage the discussion which is legitimate, and I think exactly what you want is fair. And the problem is when engaging this discussion, see, this goes back even further, when engaging this discussion of quote-unquote, terrorism or extremism, when it has a Muslim character to it, when it has a Muslim face to it, if this suspect was not Breivik, and it was, say, Nidal Hassan Malik, the gentleman who opened fire at Fort Fort Hood and killed 13 fellow soldiers. The framing of this discussion is already skewed. I'll give you an example. When it came in the early hours after we found out that this tragedy happened in Norway, mainstream media outlets, without any evidence whatsoever, and this includes the New York Times, this includes the Washington Post, this includes the Atlantic, and several of them have subsequently remedied it, all of a sudden made this out of the blue knee-jerk reaction and connection to radical Islamic terror, even though there was no evidence to associate whatsoever. But even in the most tangential manner, like, oh, this thing happened in Norway, oh, by the way, let us inelegantly connect it to radical Islam. And I think the problem is the way we frame the discourse of terrorism, radicalization. It means that the characters that we input in that narrative usually are Muslim characters, automatically knee-jerk. And that's a problem because in this environment, what happens is, first and foremost, 60% of Americans say they don't know a Muslim, and their only, if you will, framing of Muslims comes through a frame of violence. Now, in Europe specifically, when it comes to dealing with radicalization, terrorism, and violence, what people don't know is in the past 2 years, statistically, there have been nearly 500 foiled plots, failed plots, or successful plots, terrorism plots, that have been committed by what you would say non-Muslim groups, either separatist groups or right-wing groups, and there's only been about 5 plots when it comes to Muslims. So the threat is always exaggerated and lopsided. And what we've seen in America recently is that there have been twice as many terror plots committed by quote-unquote your non-Muslim groups than have been Muslim groups. But the main protagonist and the way we frame it is so lopsided, and I think the reason why it's so lopsided and the reason why we don't get a fair, and like I want a fair discussion on this as well, something which is fair, is because of certain individuals, certain organizations that have polluted the rhetoric so much that they concentrate solely on terrorism and extremism as being a Muslim issue, and then you have a population of 1.5 billion people, diverse communities, who are then lumped together, right? Whereas when it comes to Breivik, it's not the same case. It's just, okay, one individual did it, so let's not attack any of the ideological motivators potentially, or the ideological field or the mechanisms which could have kind of fertilized this. No.
Right.
It's just one sole person. But if it was Nidal Hassan Malik, then there has to be, let's connect everything. Let's talk about Owlaki, and let's talk about, Salafi theology, and let's go after all the Islam scholars whatsoever, and let's lump them all together. And I think there's incongruence there. And whether that's right or wrong, we could discuss that.
I think first of all, I think that the way that I understand why people thought that this might be the latest example of Muslim terrorism. Obviously, it was not only not Muslim terrorism, it was, in a way, even though it wasn't targeting Muslims, it was anti-Muslim terrorism of a type. But with very little evidence, or basically some anonymous dude on a chat board taking credit, people ran with this idea, and that's awful. But I think that there's a limit to how much moral equivalency you can do here. Like at this point, it seems that Breivik acted alone. For instance, there is no following. I mean, if you read the manifesto, he literally believes that this action is going to create this spontaneous movement for an anti-jihadist crusade, and that people in every country throughout the world will rise up and join his weird, crusader order where he has medals and badges that you can get for doing different things, based on the number of people you kill and the targets and whatnot. I mean, it's crazy. I don't think. I mean, maybe we don't know. Maybe he will develop a following, but to put him as the equivalent of Osama bin Laden, who had a huge following, and who even in December of this year, when Pew surveyed surveyed Muslims in 6 countries, just 6 countries, they found that the equivalent, if you added up the percentages, the equivalent of something like 130 million people supported, Osama and Al Qaeda. I don't think you're going to find that kind of support among this counter-jihad movement, much less Western countries in general. Even all these crazy people who we're talking about denounced the violence, said they couldn't support the violence, even if they thought that parts of his manifesto were not wrong, they couldn't support the violence. And so I think, there's a limit to how much we can say, oh, see, the problem with Islamic terrorism is not really that big of a deal because of Breivik. No. It doesn't actually change anything at all about whether or not there is a big problem or a little problem with Islamic terrorism. It has nothing to do with that. And so to discredit, all these people who are talking about problems that they have or that they see with Islamic terrorism because of this terror attack, it actually shouldn't change that at all. It might make us more worried about more people, but it shouldn't make us less worried about radicalization within Islam.
And I agree with, and I completely agree with that point. You shouldn't be like, take one or take the other. I agree with that. But your last point is a good one, and I agree with that in the sense that we should at least be discussing, right? We should be discussing what are the causes or drivers of a person like Breivik. We should kind of really hone in on this. And again, that's why I stress also what is the ideological environment that he comes from. What are the ideological mechanisms, if you will, ideological infrastructure? Okay. And we have no problem discussing the ideological infrastructure of when it comes to religious extremists. And as we should discuss it. But when it comes to Breivik, and I think this is a good discussion here, is that this type of rhetoric we've seen increase in the past 10 years, which is focused upon a very anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-multicultural arguments. And, let's really hone in on this now. Focus on some of these organizations and individuals. See what they're saying. See their agenda. And, and they have a First Amendment right to say what they want to say. Sure. But we also have a First Amendment right to debate it and to expose it. And when it comes, honestly, to honest discourse, I think, Mollie, you and I can safely say that there's mainstream media, there's limited time, there's talking points, there's 5-second sound bites, and there's headlines and so forth. If I'll take it back to my race relations questions, we can have someone who's conservative, we can have someone who's liberal, we can have someone who's moderate. Why are we, as a responsible society, then? Why would we actively promote David Duke types on the same level, on the same platform, and give them the same megaphone that we do responsible voices that at least have a diversity, a range of opinion? And when it comes to the writings and rhetoric of the individuals that were cited, I'm trying to expose a bigger problem here, is that we have kind of this ideological infrastructure that is in place that I think has not been exposed, and these people, these organizations have tremendous influence. I mean, for example, it was Pam Giller who coined and framed the term mega mosque at Ground Zero. She and her cadre of people turned a non-issue and helped catalyze it into a national and then international hysterical issue, which the Southern Poverty Law Center and several other groups have said has increased the divisions within America when it comes to talking about, the religious divides, and it increased what they would say is hate speech against Muslims. So how is this helpful? How is this really helping move the dialogue along? And how is this helping our national security? It isn't. And that's what I'm saying is this will be, to expose and to really discuss the ideological infrastructure from which, Breivik's Manifesto evolved, I think would do wonders here for us, and to go to your core point, so that we can effectively tackle, this concept of extremism as it appears throughout, and however it manifests. And I think we agree with that.
This actually might be a good example, because it was actually I forget the imam that was formerly affiliated with the Islamic Center near Ground Zero. What was his name?
Rauf.
Okay, so it was actually, he was the one who used the term at Ground Zero in certain time, like in other countries when he was raising the money for the mosque and or for the Islamic Center, or raising awareness of what they were trying to do. He was the one who billed it as being near Ground Zero, and really emphasized how it was cool that this was happening near Ground Zero and whatnot. And so it was extremists, sure, but people like Pamela Geller who brought that to American attention. Not well, obviously, and I totally oppose the whole fight against the mosque in general, but the mainstream media didn't think that was like an interesting thing at all, and clearly it was interesting to Americans. I think it would be better if that kind of discussion were had a little bit more responsibly, but it's not happening at all, and it's into that vacuum that these kinds of people are, they're running and they're filling that vacuum because people are really interested in this, what's happening here and whether there are any threats or not. And because because we're not having a good discussion elsewhere, and we're just told that like any discussion of that is like off limits, it leaves a huge opening for people like this. I think it's also important to remember that according to Breivik in his manifesto, he says he began the idea in 2002. So that would really be prior to all of this counter-jihad blogosphere coming up. So he's been working on this plan for quite some time, as is apparent. When you read the manifesto, it was very well designed, his terror attack and whatnot. But it came out of Bosnia. He decided that NATO assisting Muslim forces there was a bridge too far, and that's when he decided to start this plot. And certainly once he decided to do that, there was a lot of, he was interested in people talking about demographics, feminism, women in general, multiculturalism, Muslim topics. And he, you said he'd like cited so-and-so 12 times. I mean, he cites everybody a bunch of, there were at least a dozen times I saw links to Washington Post articles. I don't think the Washington Post is in any way responsible for what this guy did. This really, went back quite some distance. I read something somewhere about how it's like it's like the difference between a pilot, like a commercial pilot flying a plane, and a hijacker flying a plane. They might both be using the same, knowledge and background, but that it's their aims that are different and that we should really be focused on. And so the problem with Breivik isn't that he, heard Angela Merkel talk about multiculturalism. It's that he decided that violence was a good way to accomplish these goals rather than working democratically or trying to convince his fellow citizens of whatever his concerns were. And you can't put that on, Angela Merkel or Pamela Geller or whatnot. You can criticize one of them or the other for the way that they're bigoted or the way that they don't help a situation, but I don't think it's fair or reasonable, and it's kind of scary to me and authoritarian to start trying to put blood on their hands for something that they didn't do. And
I agree that we're not trying to put blood on their hands, but here's a point that indeed Breivik could have started his own crusade, if you will, in 2002, but ideologically, his ideas that we see manifested in his manifesto were certainly fueled, by the ideology of Pamela Geller. And he did mention Mark Twain, and he did mention John Locke. Mark Twain wrote very good fiction, and the impetus and the intention behind that fiction were to expose societal ills. The fiction that Pamela Geller and Robert Spence write is incorrect, bad fiction, number one, for those of you who have, watching, who have actually read their comments and debunked them. And you have to look, again, what does it contribute? It contributes nothing positive. What it does, again, as cited by the Anti-Defamation League, of all people, is it single-mindedly promotes a conspiratorial anti-Muslim agenda, and it seeks to divide by vilifying the Islamic faith in a way which is not at all conducive towards creating good policy, good dialogue, good debate, or good rhetoric about these issues of concern. So it poisons the well. So at least Mark Twain and John Locke contributed works of writing that help push things forward. What do the writings of Spencer and Pipes and Gabriel and Geller and all these people cited numerous times by Breivik? I mean, what do they help? How do they help in any way? They don't. Again, that's why I keep saying is that they don't have Breivik's blood on their hands, and I think we both agree on that, Mollie, that saying that is too far. What I keep saying and what I keep stressing is it's very clear from his own writings, from his own ideology, from the groups that he supported, that he was ideologically inspired and or shares certain ideological sentiments very clearly with these individuals who are given a mainstream platform. And I think if we really want to move forward, I think you do and I do, even though we have some disagreements here, I think we're actually agreeing more than we disagree, is that we want to move forward in a responsible manner to really tackle these problems in a way which is effective and efficient. You cannot do that when we tap into these individuals like Geller and Spencer as so-called regular voices whom we should endorse and promote and support. And I think we should really draw the line here on that and say, listen, sure, they have a First Amendment right, and no one's saying that they don't. They have a First Amendment right, but we do not promote every single hate monger who has a First Amendment right to get. I
guess I have yet to see any media outlet take them seriously, even present them as. In fact, I would say that they go too far sometimes in castigating them or vilifying them in just a mainstream, media story. They are rarely even mentioned. Their concerns are rarely even mentioned. And when they are, it's always in a story about Islamophobia or something like that. It's not about, any of the concerns that they're raising and being treated in any way seriously. So I've yet to see substantive media treatment of these people that is in any way flattering.
But see, the thing
I don't think. So I guess the problem. I think that's already kind of a problem in the way that their concerns are marginalized, and to further marginalize them, I don't think is a good solution. And I just keep on thinking too. It's yesterday or earlier this week was the situation at Fort Hood where a Muslim soldier who had asked for conscientious objector status, and he'd kind of received it, except that he has charges pending against him, so he has to go through a court-martial before he can be released, was arrested in some kind of attack that he'd plotted on Fort Hood. And I thought it would be really interesting to see how the media treated it the next time there was religiously connected violence, or a plot for violence. And it was really, I'm actually not that critical. People were so hesitant to play up anything about this guy's religious status or whatnot, which I actually don't have a huge problem with, as long as it's not hidden or whatnot. But it was funny, Reuters didn't mention that there was anything to do with him being Muslim until the very last paragraph of their story. And this guy had been all over the news last year, all over the news, like CNN and ABC and AP and whatnot, talking about why he wanted his CO status. And it was all because he said that as a good Muslim, he couldn't engage in a war against Muslims, and that, Islam is a religion of peace, and he just couldn't do this anymore. So there was actually video and audio of this guy talking about his religious views and how they affected his decisions. And still the media were like, well, I don't want to play up this religion angle too much. And, to contrast that with how either the early reports that Oslo was a Muslim terrorist, or the later reports that he was a Christian fundamentalist, which was, obviously not true, played out. It's just a striking difference in how it's covered. So I'm curious how you think it should be covered when there's a Muslim terrorist attacking something or getting arrested in a plot. How much do you think the religion should be mentioned, or how should it be treated? Do you think there are any lessons that have been learned from the Breivik situation, or?
I think we could see is how, and this is, as a Muslim American, a person who's sensitive to this, I think it's pretty clear that there is a lopsided difference, that when a terror suspect it happens to be Muslim, automatically, before we even venture into the ideological inspirations behind his attack, it's all of a sudden Muslim terrorist, not terrorist suspect who happens to be Muslim. And then that lumps into Islam, then that lumps into it's a lumping factor. Terrorist suspect happens to be Muslim, tied directly into Islam, tied directly into this global war on extremism, tied into directly 1.5 billion people.
Right. When it comes and they're all coming. Right?
No, but look, it's just an automatic lumping effect and connecting effect. And then when it comes to, say, an individual who happens to be, let's say, white or European, there's no, white or European, let's automatically lump to the statistics which show that there's an increase in right-wing extremism or anti-immigrant sentiment, or he's a, or let's say, he's a Christian terrorist, or he's a conservative terrorist. And, Breivik on his Facebook, self-identifies as Christian conservative. And as you can see, and I'm glad that people didn't say, and they shouldn't have said, in my opinion, and they lumped to the defense, the reaction that, oh, he's a Christian terrorist. Well, I can guarantee you that if Breivik was Muslim, and if we didn't know anything at that time, like we knew then, we knew now, they would say Muslim terrorist. And what we see, again, going back to the point we made like 25 minutes ago, when there was no evidence whatsoever of who did this or what happened, even then people in mainstream media did this, all mainstream media, they cited into radical Islam and Islamic terrorism. And you're like, what? What just happened? And so the thing is, I think the shorthand discourse internationally is that anything terrorist, anything violent, all of a sudden has to be Islamic. And that is a problem in the way we frame our discourse. That all of a sudden when there's terrorism involved, all of a sudden when there's extremism involved, it has to be quote-unquote Islamic Muslim, even before the facts come out. And that colors not only how we discuss about religion, that colors not only to talk about national security and these important issues of extremism, but then that colors also how we talk about people, how we talk about communities, and specifically Muslim communities. And I think this is why this is so dangerous, because the people, Mollie, people are affected, where it's all lumped together. Whereas a guy like Breivik can do it, and even if they say it's Christian conservative, no problem, but no one's going to go after all conservatives or all Christians. And Christian conservatives say, okay, that's just one lone guy.
Okay, I want to agree in part and disagree in part. First off, I think that one of the biggest problems that happens when we just make like Muslim terrorism this thing that is, that we don't understand and that all Muslims take part in or whatnot, is that we forget the fact that far and away the most people who suffer from Muslim terrorism are Muslims.
Yes.
I mean, that is,
right.
It's not even close. I mean, the people who are really dealing with this are people in, dozens of countries throughout the world who are dealing with, who are trying to combat extremism in their midst. And it's infuriating to see the way that we gloss over that in our coverage, and just failure to even understand terms that separate these different groups and doctrinal distinctions that separate them and whatnot. But having said that, I think that you can take this moral equivalency just way too far. I just read a poll yesterday of Indonesian youth, and a majority of them support Al-Qaeda. And it was a Goethe Institute poll. I mean, it's not like you're going to find that kind of support for, like, did Breivik self-identify as a conservative Christian? Yes, he did. Is his manifesto full of, many things, from video gaming down to scripture? And does he, as a part of that, try and make a case for violence using scripture? Yeah, he does. It's very much like an Al-Qaeda tract that way. Does that mean that they're equivalent? Well, the terror attacks were certainly equivalent, but what about the following? I mean, that's what I think we can take it too far by forgetting that there is a significant movement within Islam. There's been this strain that's there that is, oriented toward violence, and it's a significant problem with millions of adherents. And until such time as you're seeing that level of support among Christians for Breivik, I think it's really not helpful to make it out to be the same thing. I mean, there are similarities. It's certainly true. But the bigger thing that I think we should be thinking about is the fact that there is all this support for terrorism in defense of Islam among Muslim youth and in Muslim countries throughout the world. And that's not something you're really seeing with the Breivik situation, right?
No, I would disagree with that. I'm no one saying that the quote-unquote Christian terrorism is the same as religiously inspired extremism that's coming from Muslims. I'm not even making that equivalency. I'm saying how, exactly how you just did, how we frame this and how we discuss this is important, because, look, there's 1.5 billion Muslims in this world, okay? And, Islam doesn't speak, but Muslims do. An overwhelming majority of them, according to the statistics, renounce extremism. The Gallup World Poll,
yes.
the Pew
yes.
Poll, and, even national security sectors are saying, listen, Muslim, especially Muslim Americans here, overwhelming majority of them are allies. And when it comes to, this connotation, immediate knee-jerk reaction to say Islam, terrorism, Islam, extremism. And again, I think that poisons the rhetorical well, if you will, the ideological well, and even how we deal with each other and discuss religion in a fair and diverse manner. And specifically when it comes to saying, all these millions and millions of Muslims, well, there's a billion that are against it. And just like when it comes to if you look at the statistics, one could correlate. Well, look, there's 500 terror attacks in Europe in the past, foiled terror attacks or plans or attacks in 2009, 2010 in Europe, and only 5 of those were Muslim. The rest of them were inspired by, we could say, right-wing reactionary movements or anti-separatist movements. We don't frame the dialogue as such. What we focus on specifically is the Muslim, and I think
I just want to clarify. I think I read a report this week where they, broke it down where most of these thwarted attacks came from, and there were none that were right wing. There were quite a few that were separationist, but I think Breivik is the first right wing terrorist attack of recent vintage.
Well, it's
unless you define separatist as right wing.
And it is. Well, okay, we can disagree on that, but we can even venture forward and see the more statistics on that. But I think again, it goes.
The point is, that we shouldn't always assume.
I'm trying to deal with how do we move forward here in a way which really, I think, in a fair manner, in a responsible manner, discusses these issues in a way where we can. I think we all want the same thing, right? We want to be able to tackle these issues in a manner which makes us all safer. But at the same time, I think the ideological framework, the ideological framing, the ideological infrastructure that is in place, that does, I think, not expose some of these very dangerous and very unhelpful ideologues and organizations that have tremendous influence in the background, right? I think that doesn't do us any justice, and
I think it's also though really.
And I think the fact is we should expose it. Look at the citations. These people did not. Let me repeat this. These people did not catapult him to do it. The blood is on Breivik's hands. But the ideological infrastructure. He shares the same ideologies when it comes to the quote unquote manufactured threat that all Muslims are. Islam is colonizing Europe. Or that there's no distinction between moderate Islam or radical Islam. And even though he did begin, like you said, in 2002, the Spencers, the Gillers, the Pipes, the Gaffneys, their ideology did not deter him from continuing on this, ideological path.
I just think that's a really bad road to go down. Just this week we've seen unbelievably heated rhetoric about, Tea Partiers and conservatives. I think it was Krugman said that they were the Hezbollah faction of the Republican Party. Of course, Harry Reid once said that Tea Partiers weren't Americans. Andrew Sullivan questions he calls Sarah Palin and her lady parts treasonous like twice a day. You can see there. The New York Mag has a article about how Christians are in a college in New York right now, and it's it actually kind of almost reads like a mirror image piece of some of these Islamophobic sites. And you have Harper's 5 years ago said that Christians had reached the point where we couldn't engage in actual political solutions with them. There are all sorts of ways that people do this all across the spectrum. And if someone were to, after reading that Harper's article, decide that, these people are no longer able to be dealt with politically, so therefore we must kill them, could you blame Harper's? I guess, but it doesn't seem very helpful because they weren't actually advocating violence. They, just because someone can take these unhinged comments about Sarah Palin or Tea Partiers or Christians or whatever it is that are happening in the pages of the New York Times and decide to add violence to it does not mean that these people should be castigated for just having, basically convictions. Everyone thinks that whatever they're talking about is a moral threat. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be talking about it. And I just would be really uncomfortable if our response to that is to be we really need to shun and isolate these people even further. I actually think that these people, particularly the extremist group, the more extreme in their rhetoric, they've caused problems for themselves by the way they talk. They're no longer taken seriously by, a vast majority of people. They're like the Ted Rall cartoon of the right. They're only read by their opponents so that they can feel moral superiority or whatnot. But I think that, there are legitimate concerns about Muslim terrorism, and that the response, if you're going to have a response, should be to bring that discussion more into the light of day rather than further isolating and pretending like it's not a real threat or not a real problem just because these, bigoted extremists go way too far in the way that they talk about it. And I just also say, I hate the idea that a terrorist, I was reading the manifesto, and at some point he talks about how he killed all these people, or he's going to kill all these people, so that as a marketing ploy, so that people will read his manifesto, which just made me feel sick as I'm reading it, because of course, why am I reading it other than just that reason? And I hated that I was like falling into this trap. But I also think that, when you do whatever, when you respond too much, maybe even at all, to a terrorist, an outlier, a dude with no following who is an extremist, and you change what you're doing as a result, I think that's morally indefensible. And I think that we should, whatever we think about the counter-jihadists is something we should think regardless of whether some asshole in Norway, added violence to their rhetoric. And other than that, I don't want to respond too much more to this guy.
I think this comes to a point where we have to see that the ideological infrastructure, I think, exists. I think it has poisoned mainstream national discourse and the framing of how we talk about not only national security and extremism, but also how we talk about religion, and also how we talk about specifically Muslim communities. I hope you're right that these people become fringe and implode based on the hysterical notion that they have. But what we do know, Mollie, is that this type of discourse has infected mainstream discourse to the point where everything is lumped together, and now we have 2012 Republican presidential candidates who are using wedge issues based around quote unquote Muslim threat, specifically just to show you how that poisons the well. We have Herman Cain, for example, saying Americans should ban mosques going to Murfreesboro, and then the mosques, therefore, its First Amendment, are protected as places of worship. But if you look again at the ideological background of all these people who are cited, they specifically say, no, what mosques are Trojan horses that help radical Islam subvert Western culture, etc., etc., etc. And all of it then becomes tied to, and again, I know you don't do this and responsible conservatives don't do this, but what happens, it becomes tied to extremism, terrorism, Islamic terrorism. And all of it always gets lumped together. And so these people, such as the Gellers and such as the Spencers, outwardly, people might shun them, but they're part of an ideological infrastructure which is very influential, which is now not only framed the way we talk about national security, but I think again has now been mainstreamed and frames the way we talk about domestic policy, frames the way we talk about Muslims, frames the way we talk about diversity, and all of it I'm saying is the ideological infrastructure is poisonous, it's hate-filled, it's bigoted, and that's why I think it's a good thing where we can unite here. And I can unite with you on this and say, listen, let's look at the ideological infrastructure of all these people, and then let's remove it, right? Let's remove these people, and let's remove this dialogue. They have a First Amendment right to say what they want to say, and we're not authoritarian people to come in this, but we have a right to expose it for what it is, and if it's unhelpful, we should expose it as unhelpful. Those people who want to follow it, let them. But I think overwhelming majority of people will say, this is unhelpful to moving things forward. And if someone does that also in an unhealthy manner on the opposite side, let's expose it too, and make sure we really tackle this in a responsible fashion. Not lump all Christian conservatives as terrorists just because Andrews Breivik did it. Not lump all Muslims just because there happens to be someone who is ideologically inspired by religious extremism. And let's really push things forward now and talk about this in a responsible fashion. And I think this is a good opportunity. If we can get something good out of it, we can push the dialogue forward and frame it in a helpful manner.
Well, I know we need to wrap this up, but I feel like this is another great example of proper and improper responses to this type of rhetoric. So you have this situation where, if you look at the 9/11 bombers or whatnot, they were clearly involved with a mosque that's local to me here in Northern Virginia, which has also had a bunch of other terrorists coming out of it. A man named Anwar al-Awlaki was imam there, was on staff there, and at the time this happened, at the time September 11th, at the time of the terror attacks, the media was not in any way investigating thoroughly what was happening in this mosque that's nearby. And there are actually two in Northern Virginia where they're a few too many ties to terrorism to make people comfortable. And in fact, they had Anwar al-Awlaki leading a Ramadan chat after September 11th at the Washington Post. And I think that rather than, that when these people are saying, when people are like, we will ban these mosques from coming here, obviously that's an untenable position for people to have in a country that guarantees religious freedom and as much as we do. On the other hand, the media need to, there's like an actual question there, like how do we navigate this situation when sometimes terror cells are using the cover of a mosque to operate, or when there's stuff happening there, people are hearing things. Like, I would like to see maybe just a little bit less. I think that would be okay for the media to ask a few more questions so that people who have legitimate concerns about possibly violence being preached at a house of worship, rather than having them go to the extreme of trying to ban a mosque from being built in their backyard, if we could have just a little bit better discussion about what might be happening in one mosque over another, or what separates the mosque that breeds terrorists from the mosque that wants nothing to do with terrorism. And these are the types of questions that we should be seeing more brought into the media, so that people aren't just running off to these extremist websites to have these discussions or foment plans to take away people's First Amendment freedoms. And so I would just say that if you do think that these websites or essays or whatnot had something to do with radicalizing Breivik, there's an argument to be made for actually engaging this debate more openly and using our best arguments to combat, fears, concerns, or even just to learn more about those fears and concerns. I don't want to, act like there's nothing to be learned from other people here, rather than trying to shun all concerns that people might have about Muslim terrorism, which we all acknowledge is a problem throughout the world. Rather than burying our heads in the sand about it and further radicalizing these people, I think we need to go ahead and let the media have, shed more light on the discussion and the debate, so that we can all benefit from it.
Anyway. And just to conclude off your last point, just like we have no problem exposing the ideological infrastructure and potential motivators and markers and connections, what inspires religious extremism, even if it is Islamic extremism, in the last 10 years. I think we should have no problem exposing or identifying, or at the very least, researching the ideological infrastructure from which Breivik emerged, and to really tackle it and to investigate it. And I think,
and I would say, if you find any calls to violence, obviously that should be highlighted. And if we find that these people are actually advocating violence and not, as it seems that they're not advocating violence, then that should be shouted out loud. If it's just one guy responding to millions of people concerned about multiculturalism or the threat of Islamic terrorism by shooting up a camp, I don't know.
And I also think we have to make sure, hopefully, that this is a lone incident, and we have to ensure that this will not happen again. And we have to hopefully make sure that we try our best to create an environment where Breivik is just one man, and that he will not be inspired. Other people will not be inspired by him, and hopefully there's not an environment which exists which would inspire other people to, God forbid, embark on the violent, tragic actions that he embarked on. Yeah.
Agreed. Okay, well, we should wrap this up. It was really nice talking to you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Molly. This was fun. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.